inspiration is a remorseless thing that doesn't really give you any choice. And it's not about finding inspiration often for me, it's about avoiding it and actually escaping it so that I can consider doing other things. And, when inspiration comes, it's like a thunderbolt, and it's not something you can deny. You deny it at your peril. You have to follow through.
Have you ever tried to deny it?
Well, yes, this is why I speak from experience, and in some ways there's nothing worse that I know of feeling that you have lost or wasted an opportunity, because, when I talk about inspiration, I don't mean just having an idea for a tune or, fantasy about some piece in the far off future. I'm talking about something that is going to change you as a person, so that when you come out the other end of it, you will have been transformed by the experience. And when I go into a piece, I go in a certain person and I come out of it another person, because it's utterly immersive, it's incredibly difficult, and it requires something very deep within you to do it. It's to do with your relationship with it, with the music, with the work. And so inspiration is an opportunity to manifest whatever that is. And if you deny it, it's really denying an opportunity to grow. I see it as the equivalent of voluntarily destroying millions of brain cells, and diminishing yourself in some way. I think that for me, you don't actually need a lot of ideas. It's not about the quantity of the ideas. I think that if you approach creativity, or if your relationship with creativity is a particular kind of thing, then in some ways the ideas are not the meat of it. They're not the main thing. It's to do with the motivation. All ideas can really be transmuted into something that has meaning if you have skill and craft. But it's really what that meaning is. And that meaning comes from your motivation, what it is you're trying to do. And so, in some ways, to me, I believe that it doesn't matter if I'm writing a string quartet or working with a rock musician, collaborating with a rock musician. It doesn't really matter what the parameters of the project are, because the motivation is always the same. It always comes from the same source. And projects and pieces and ideas are really just vessels for the realization of intention.
And so what is the motivation? What is your primary motivation?
I feel that what it is that ultimately I'm hoping I do is trying to create objects that are charged with the positive energy, and to release them into the world so that that positive energy somehow, if the best circumstances exist, transfers to another human being, and there is a transfer of a positive sharing. That's what motivated me to get into music. It was my experience as a listener, as a young person. I realised that this music wasn't just entertainment. It wasn't just passing the time and feeling okay. It was actually giving me, in its own abstract, bizarre way, a reason to keep living. At the worst of times, I think Beethoven is a fantastic model for this, but then so are jazz musicians, Keith Jarrett, Pat Metheny, and songwriters. They're embedded in the best music is the reason that it's good to live, the reason that it's good to be here, and why it's good to have friends and to be part of a community and a family. And that's something that informs every single choice I make in every single piece. Every note is inspired by that pursuit.
Once a composition is done, do you find that you hold on to it in your being, or can you put it aside?
That is such a rolling relationship with each work that you create. It's just not a fixed relationship at all. And I find sometimes when I am going through a kind of crisis, an insecurity or something like that, I'll listen to the early works and think, did I divert at some point into some terrible path, and start writing rubbish? And then I'll go back through the works and I'll listen essentially for one thing, which is a sincerity, a genuineness, in the work. And I'm very fortunate in that I find it. Either I'm like ultimately blinded, or it is there. And I believe that it's there. I listen to that music of 20 years ago and I think, well, that guy meant that when he wrote that. He really meant it. And that's the kind of relationship. But to answer it a different way, when you write a work, there is this kind of curating that happens initially, where you kind of track the performances and you make sure it's getting played well, and you really worry about the audience reaction. And then after time, the piece finds its place. It's either going to head towards oblivion, which means it'll just disappear from the world, or it'll get some traction and it'll live, it'll survive, and it'll exist. And either way, you let go, because you cease to have control over it, after a while. But actually, there is another answer to that, which is probably the answer, which is, for me, once works are recorded, once I have a recording that I produced, and it's a definitive recording for me, and it's released into the world, I really feel like I can let go of the work at that point. So recordings are quite profound for the composer, because it exists and it can't be broken. It doesn't matter if somebody performs it at half tempo, full of mistakes, and the audience just think, what the hell was that? Because the recording exists, and they can go to that recording and think, this is what the composer meant to write. This is what this piece is supposed to say.
So what, to you, is a good piece of music?
I think that if you look at music that survives over time, there is something unique and common to all of that music, in my opinion. And what it is that as that music was being created, the creators, they experienced their own sense of revelation as they were creating the work. Now, that's common, that happens a lot. But what differentiates good music from great music is that I think in great music, the creators of the music managed somehow to embed that sense of revelation into the work, so that when you experience the work afterwards, you re-experience that revelation that the creator had. And that, for me, is what makes a good piece of music. Well, actually, it's what makes a great piece of music. And that's why in my own writing, the way that I work, I try very hard to get into that. Well, I can only ever write if I am in that zone, which is this zone of discovery and revelation. And I feel it in a lot of my works, and I think it's the only sort of feature of the works that allows them to survive, is that sense of discovery and revelation that's in the music itself.
So can you tell me what it's like, that zone of discovery?
Yeah, there's been some writing about it recently. It's been described as flow. This idea that everything lines up and everything about you becomes incorporated into this moment. And it is a moment. It's like a flash, but it lasts for minutes or hours, weeks, months, depending on how long the process is. And it is really, for me, like stepping into a parallel universe where there is no one but me in this entire universe. But it's a thriving, active, exciting universe. But I'm the sole inhabitant. And harnessing all of the energy and the beauty, all those things, it's being lost in that, but not being lost because you're also driven. It's a very driven thing. It's really a great paradoxical experience. It's all sorts of things, It's completely private, and yet you're trying to speak to the world. It's incredibly lonely and insecure, but yet you're totally confident and sure of yourself at the same time. You're completely unsure of what's ahead, but you just know what's next. These things coexisting, these paradoxical states, it is the greatest thing ever that I've experienced. And you know how people game, they play PlayStation or Xbox, and there's that whole study of the psychology of addiction, they can't let go of it. That's what, for me, composing is. When I'm composing, I desperately don't want to stop. And not because of the deadlines and the pressure, but just because it really is another experience of life. And it's weird, I'm here in this little room with my computer and the piano, and I'm having this transcendental cosmic experience every time that I sit down to compose. And, then I have to step out the door into the bleary sunlight and engage with other human beings. And that's very difficult sometimes because they don't know where I've been and I can't explain it. And you can't share it. You can only share it through the work itself. And, you have to think that I don't have like a social life, I'm not sort of worried about this, but I systematically lost all of my friends over the last 20 years because I was never available. And I don't do anything other than this thing. So I don't know how I love this quote I heard of Charles Bukowski, the American poet, where he was being asked repeatedly when he gave these seminars and workshops. They said, how do I become a great poet too? And he said his answer always was, look, everybody wants to be a great poet, but nobody wants to miss a meal. Nobody wants to make any sacrifice. And, the thing we're talking about, I see it all around me. People want something, but there's a cost, there's a price to that. And that price for a composer it's a really big price. There's a huge amount of isolation, definitely isolation. And, if you don't know how to deal with that, it becomes loneliness. But there's also the sense of, why do this? The world is fraught with so many things. Become a scientist, become a research scientist and solve some problems. There's all that sort of stuff. But mostly the sacrifice is to do with time. It's a life's worth of time that goes into this to try and achieve at least one good piece.
Just finally, I wonder if you had to impart some wisdom or advice to a composer just starting out, what would that be?
Well, I have to do this quite frequently in my teaching, and one of the, it sounds like a terrible piece of advice, but it's a very true one, which is you need to believe that the worst possible outcome, the worst case scenario of a performance of your work, the greatest humiliation, is survivable, and you'll be okay. What happens with composers is they have, at the beginning especially, very few experiences, and so the performances come to mean a huge amount. They're profound in their impact. So a positive performance can be incredibly energizing and sustain a composer for years. And a negative performance can stop them altogether forever, if they're at a fragile enough stage. And that's one of the key things I say, is that as bad as it is, it's not the end. It must never be the end. And the only reason anybody should ever stop composing is if they've taken it as far as they possibly can and they don't think they have a contribution to make. At that point, they decide for themselves, but never to decide it for the sake of external factors. It's always got to be internal. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, and I've already said this, it's the work ethic. It's just, you cannot, it's not possible to overestimate how much work is involved in creating your best piece. One of the things that has been on my mind a lot lately is how often I hear amongst my friends and peers and colleagues, composers, about new work saying, oh, it's good, but if I had a bit more time, it would be even better. And I started to think about that a lot a number of years ago, thinking, well, what does that mean? If you're always saying if there was more time, because I've said that too, then you're never going to write the best pieces you're capable of. You're always going to think, well, you'll give yourself comfort by thinking it could have been better. You'll accept the flaws and the faults of the work. So that's the other piece of advice that I have, to always allow enough time to write your best works, to not accept that, well, there's never enough time, to not think of things that way. Because then I think that when you're older, when you're at the other end and you're looking back, I assume there will be huge regret and remorse at not putting more time into fewer works.